So as part of our retreat, we have not just been meditating on Shenrezi or Vajrasattva, but we've also had the opportunity to study and receive many powerful teachings, including from Geshe Topke on Dependent Arising and the Rice Seedling Sutra, and from Venerable Children on Emptiness and the Heart Sutra. So knowing that study and these teachings were going to be a part of my retreat, I of course set some goals early on to do lots of study on many different topics, because of course we also have Vinaya teachings too, and all these other things. And, you know, a little tiny bit has happened of that study, not that much. And part of it was that I hit a bit of a wall early on. This thought that, okay, I'll study emptiness. I'll really work on this. I started looking at volumes 7, 8, and 9 of the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. You know, and I was trying to really, my thought was, okay, I'll really work on, you know, the fivefold analysis and these different specific analyses refuting inherent existence, and I didn't understand them. I can understand the words. I can even repeat to you of how a chariot is not the shape of its parts. But I really could see in my own mind that there was a foundation that I was lacking, that these analyses, this discussion was happening in a context, and I didn't know the context. So I kind of put down volumes 7, 8, and 9, figuring out that I needed something else first. But there was something else I was also studying that I started to think might be giving me that foundation. And a few of us have a Tibetan class, and what we have been working on for the past few months is initially translating Dharmakirti's Naya Bindu, or Drops of Reasoning, and that's fairly short. So once we did that, and I'll read a few verses so you'll see how clear it is in English, then we've been translating Vinitadeva's commentary, which is much longer, and we're a few lines or verses in. But so I'm finding this really interesting, and I find that this sort of philosophical study, you know, isn't just intellectual brain candy, but really I start to see how it connects with everything we're trying to do in our Buddhist practice. And verse 1 of Dharmakirti's Naya Bindu, it totally agrees with me. Since correct knowledge is a prerequisite for accomplishing all the aims of beings, I will teach that. Right? We have to know things if we actually want to accomplish our aims. I like that. Now later on it gets a little less clear, so parts of verse 13, 14, and 15, any object that is different in its appearance to a consciousness due to being near or far is a specifically characterized phenomena. That specifically characterized phenomena is an ultimate existent because the definition of a thing is that which is able to perform a function. So clearly it's a little bit difficult to just jump on in and understand this root text. And so even Vinitadeva's commentary, which is also not so clear. Sometimes we just come to the conclusion it made more sense in Sanskrit. So to help understand this, we're reading George Dreyfus's Reconciling Reality. And to give you a sense of how far we are, this is how much we've read. So I'll talk about this a little bit because it's really made an impact on me, but the caveat is I maybe have some understanding of the first 5 chapters, and there's about 30 chapters, so maybe what I think I understand will be refuted by the latter 3/4 of the book. And this is also not that clear when you really are new to this and have no idea what these words mean. And so we're also reading the lectures that George Dreyfus gave when he taught this at University of Virginia 2 or 3 decades ago. So why do I find this helpful? It's really presenting the terminology, concept, structure, and background that is needed to actually understand what Chandrakirti is talking about when he starts dissecting that chariot. It also really is helping me understand the relationship between epistemology, so understanding kind of what we perceive and how we know things, and ontology, what exists. And so this I find really helpful because I'm not used to thinking this way. I'm used to more of a scientific materialist point of view where I set up my instrument, it measures something, and that exists. And so really stepping into this philosophical framework is really helping me tease these things apart, and there's great value in that. The other thing that I find helpful, especially about how Dreyfus presents this, is the context. It's not just what one specific Tibetan scholar, Lama, said, or even what one specific Indian scholar said, but how do these different commentaries agree or disagree, even when they're commenting on the same text? And who are they actually debating against? Because sometimes what the statements that are being made really are about is refuting another view. And if we don't know what those views are, sometimes the statements themselves don't seem to make sense. So as an example of maybe the one thing that I slightly have learned about so far is this idea of universals. And it gets translated lots of different ways, so generally characterized phenomena or conceptual construct. Later on, when it gets into actual perception, which we haven't gotten to yet, that idea of like a mental image, there's many different terms we might use referring to this idea. And the examples that Dreyfus gives is, for instance, a species, such as human being or horse, properties, such as being a tree, or relations, such as being wiser than somebody else. So this universal, one form of it's, for instance, treeness. You know, not just that specific tree, but the general understanding of treeness, you know, somehow permeating all of the world. And it's interesting because, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, at least some Buddhist philosophers would say, well, that's something permanent. That is something ineffectual. It can't have an effect. And it is therefore unreal. Now, there's then this long, extensive discussion as to the difference between exist and real, and I don't understand that one yet. There's at least different views. But this distinction between what is real and what is not real is really this fundamental question. And as an example of an opposing theory, the Nyaya, another, it was a Hindu philosophy in the ancient India, so at the time of Dharmakirti, you know, they were holding that these identities, such as treeness or cowness or redness, that these exist really, 100% real, independent of an individual tree. So the idea that somehow treeness could exist even in a universe where there is no trees. So that's obviously a pretty extreme view. So as an example, you know, we can start, though, applying this to other things and really tease apart our understanding. And again, this epistemology of how do I know something, and that ontology of does it exist? How does it exist? So is the jar real? And it's helpful to remember that within Dharmakirti, we're really working on a Sartantrika tenet system level. This is not Madhyamaka, because as I figured out at the beginning of the retreat, I don't understand Madhyamaka. So we can think of this as kind of this Abhidharma perspective, that there really are these particles that make up the jar. Great, that sounds familiar to a scientist. And we can also think about it in terms of sense spheres. So, you know, taste and touch and sight, and sound is a little tricky, but, you know, our perceptions, how we view the world. So jar is this wonderful example of, you know, what does it mean for this to be real or not? And one of the examples, and I'll read this 2 paragraphs that really unpacks this, of how this jar is not real. And this is looking at one of the Tibetan commentators, Lo Khenchen. And we can say that, you know, those initial particles are real, and we can say that maybe shape and color is real, but we use convenient terms to designate objects we deal with in our daily life as if those objects were real and perceived as they are. These names are not given arbitrarily, but neither do they directly correspond to what exists. So I find this interesting because, again, this isn't Madhyamaka. This isn't refuting inherent existence, which helps me see that I need to understand a lot more about these lower tenet systems, because when I think before I was just refuting inherent existence, it's no, I was maybe doing a Sautantrika level analysis. When we use the term jar, for example, we in fact refer to a component of the jar, such as its shape or tangible aspect, right? I know what a jar looks like. I know what a jar smells like. I could taste the jar. You know, I feel the jar and it feels a certain way. Each of these exist on its own, right? Together they form what we commonly call material objects, but they are apprehended by different types of perception. And so when we perceive the shape of a jar, we do not fully perceive that jar, which is constructed out of those different components. Or you could even take that perspective of the 4 elements of the earth element, wind element, and so forth. So we're only perceiving certain aspects of the jar at once, and then we put over top of this conceptual construct of jarness. But that is the label we give for the sake of convenience. And so the point here is that a jar, as the sum total of its parts, does not exist in reality. But it's still a conventional description that we give to it. It's convenient. So I find this really interesting because, again, it sounds somewhat similar to the type of analysis we're doing when we're looking at the emptiness of inherent existence. But this is a totally different, much, much lower tenet system, a much simpler philosophy. So if I can start to understand this, then I know that I need to go much, much farther if I actually want to understand what inherent existence is. So now, of course, well, the most important thing is trying to use this sort of reasoning and analysis to deconstruct my own erroneous ideas about the world. It is much easier to point fingers at other people and point out how their reasoning is not logical. And so at this point, maybe I need a trigger warning. I wanted to apply some of what I've been learning from Dharmakirti and Dreyfus and all of the other people in between, to an executive order that came out from the president's office on January 20th of this year. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because that would definitely be triggering, but part of what grabbed me about this and why I think these things relate is in the first really just opening introduction, he refers to the people who deny the biological reality of sex. He refers to the people who are making efforts to eradicate the biological reality of sex, and then also refers to the immutable biological reality of sex. Well, in addition to the word reality showing up there over and over again, I found it interesting, again, after reading all of these logical arguments, and especially how Dharmakirti would critique the Samkhyas and the Nyaya, I'm like, wow, you think it's possible to eradicate something that is also immutable? You've already contradicted yourself in the introduction. And, we would say, that idea of eradicating a reality, we say that when we realize the emptiness of inherent existence, it isn't that we destroyed it. It didn't exist to begin with. So if people were making efforts to eradicate the biological reality of sex, and that was somehow a threat to it, then it must not have existed to begin with. It certainly was not immutable. So I did appreciate that definitions were given later down in this policy. But I think these definitions have some problems. And so one definition for sex, it says, shall refer to an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. And then later, the definition of female means a person belonging to, at conception, to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell, and male means a person belonging to, at conception, to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. So those definitions seem a little circular, but we see those a lot in Buddhism, so I can't really critique it on that level. But what I found really interesting is this notion of, okay, we're defining sex based on, we're defining female and male based on the sex that the person belongs to at conception based on that. Oh, okay. Based on the sex producing a certain type of reproductive cell. Yes, Venerable?
Reproductive cells are not manifest.
Exactly. Yes, so that was exactly the point I wanted to make. So the reproductive cells are not manifest at conception. So at conception, you have a zygote. You don't have ovaries and testes or any sort of organs whatsoever. So for the sake of time, I won't read it, but there's a whole takedown, at least from the Sakya perspective, on how you can't really say something is real that extends over multiple points in time. And so in this case, you're somehow saying we're going to specify them based on something at conception that can only actually be perceived, measured, or even inferred at some time much, much later. And I'm not even going to get into the biological critique that sex is not this simple, that not everyone who appears female, feels female, that, even Donald Trump would say, yes, she's female, has the ability to produce large reproductive cells. I mean, this is not black and white. It is not that there is a dichotomy and every single person is going to fit one of these two definitions. So again, it is not self-consistent. Now, it was interesting in that there was something pointed out here that I actually did agree with. Gender ideology is internally inconsistent in that it diminishes sex as an identifiable or useful category, but nevertheless maintains that it is possible for a person to be born in the wrong sexed body. This is in a way true. Or at least when I was in college taking classes on gender and sexual studies, I had this qualm, I had this difficulty. And actually now, especially after reading all of this analysis of Dharmakirti, I really don't have a problem with this, that there are different scales of analyses, that sometimes we need to work at the conventional level, that, okay, we're gonna have 2 bathrooms and, you pick one. But ultimately, it isn't that it exists in that way. And so just as we can say, yes, this is a jar, that's different than the jar being real. And so depending on how you want to actually do the analysis, you might reach different conclusions. And Dreyfus shows again and again that Dharmakirti is not self-consistent, even in the same work. And that isn't because he didn't know what he was doing, but it was because you can talk about epistemology on kind of a more straightforward basis. And he was in particular refuting people who weren't even Buddhists. Starting with Yogacara wasn't going to get him very far. So he started with Sautrantrika. So again, I find that it's like that is not a criteria to say we have to toss it out the window. It's that is actually just how we engage with the world on different levels of existence or truth, as we would say from a Vajramaka point of view, those conventional veiled truths and then the ultimate truth. So I wanted to close with another passage from Dreyfus because, again, I love this book and I love his writing, and I think that part of it, it's really the same thing that I see in the presentation from Jeffrey Hopkins, that yes, this is someone who is an academic and that they have a professional title, they have a PhD, they are writing books that get published by academic presses. But these are people who are not studying Buddhism as this thing to be kept at a distance and this thing that is seen as, very abstract or purely historical or some, cute sociology thing. It's something that they really respect and practice. And so I think he keeps coming back to that repeatedly, that even this philosophical approach that Dharmakirti and others are taking, that this is not, again, just some mental exercise to be dealt with by academics and intellectuals, but really is about our practice. So this is from Dreyfus, early on, parts that I've read. Buddhism teaches that human beings can liberate themselves from suffering through a correct understanding of reality. We usually understand reality through perception and form wrong views, such as the substantial existence of persons, on the basis of these experiences. So the first step in a Buddhist liberative strategy is to gain a clear understanding of experience. This is achieved by developing mindfulness toward the 4 kinds of objects: body, feeling, consciousness, and mental factors, as we did in our retreat last year, so hopefully we're well on our way. Analyzing experience into different elements is essential to developing this practice. It permits us to disengage from our tendency to reify diverse elements into unities. To cure us of our constant reification, the Abhidharma differentiates objects into sense spheres and elements. In applying this teaching to experience, common sense objects are found to consist of an aggregation of elements. These elements come apart through the power of mindfulness. The objects in which we have such strong confidence are found under analysis to be reducible to their components. Being real only to the common sense world, they exist only at a superficial level. They are to be displaced by the practice of the path. So, again, it's easy to point fingers and critique other people's reasoning, but the most important work we have to do is to then turn these tools of analysis and logic to our own mind to understand what we are reifying about ourselves, about other people. And I'm seeing that it's helpful for me to even start at this Sartantrika, Vaibhasika, Abhidharma level that still does this sort of deconstruction. And hopefully, as I start to understand the process and terminology and context better here, I'll eventually understand what Chandrakirti was talking about and will actually be able to refute inherent existence.